One of the last steps for this exercise, we're going to be going over clipping masks and using clipping masks in Illustrator. And this is something that's good to work with when you're working with something like Illustrator to develop UX UI designs. I know I've talked a lot about how you don't want to use Illustrator to edit pixel-based images. That's what you're using a pixel editor for, like Photoshop. However, there are times, especially when you're doing something like this, where you are incorporating, or when your final product, so when you're working with UX UI designs, these files aren't going to be in Illustrator. When you plug them into the app, you're going to be exporting these either as sometimes as bitmaps, depending upon what you're doing with them, or most likely you're going to be programming them in and coding them into the parts of the visual interface of whatever the app is. So you are going to be, so part of that app is going to be, for instance, with Spotify, this app is probably, the way that it's programmed is that it is programmatically defining these different visual components of the user interface. And so those of you that work with HTML and web design, you know that there's a lot of ways to visually mark up a page, and there's parts of the code that say, okay, this is what font you're going to display, this is what the layout's going to be, this is where you're going to place this image, etc., etc. And so the basic idea translates for app design, where the interface itself is part of the programmed environment, but when it's doing something like bringing in bitmap images, so even with websites, you're saying, you know, the browser is not composing each of these images, so it's not trying to define the specific pixel images when you're loading Instagram. The program is saying this is what the container looks like, and then it's then saying, okay, now go to this pixel image and display this pixel image this way. And so this is just a long explanation for why you do want to be working with pixel images in Illustrator when you're working with UI UX design, so you can get a sense of how to design around them, and how, since these pixel images, so in things like Instagram, even things like Spotify, where you are bringing in these pixel images from other sources, those are an integrated part of those user interface designs. So you do want to know, you're not using Illustrator in these situations to edit the pixel images themselves, but you are using Illustrator to sometimes change the way that those images are appearing on the screen and within the vector graphics that you've created. And so one big way to do that is with image masks. And I'm going to use this example from how Spotify integrates these pixel-based images into its user interface, and how we can use Illustrator to further develop how these pixel images actually appear within whatever graphics you're working with. So this is something that I see a lot in beginning when people are first starting to work with Illustrator and trying to incorporate pixel images within Illustrator. And so this is something, you know, you do it a lot for UX UI design. You're going to be doing this with print design, so you're designing a book, and maybe that book does have some photographs in it. You're not going to be using Illustrator to create those photographs, but you are wanting to figure out how the layout is going to flow around those photographs. So at some point, you're going to need to have, even just if it's a placeholder image, you're going to need to see that photograph, even if it's low quality, and just seeing how the vector files and the vector graphics and the vector images that you're creating interact with that pixel image. So what I see a lot is when people are first starting to work with this, what you're able to do with pixel images is very basic compared to what you can do in Photoshop. And so a lot of times I'll see people or I'll just see instances of someone saying, okay, well, this is the image that I have, and this is straight from my phone, so I need to get it to fit into this space, and I don't really know how to make it fit other than to use these transform boundaries and use this bounding box to change it, but now I see that I have a totally distorted image. And this is something that happens all the time. And I totally understand why, because when you're used to working in Photoshop with these pixel-based images, you're able to do so much more with them, but it's really hard to know how to then edit and work with pixel images when you're in Illustrator, because it is so geared towards vector images. But you don't have to resort to doing things like this. And one really useful tool and something that I wish I had known about when I first started working with Illustrator is how to apply a clipping mask to the image that you bring in. So let me undo my amazing distortions, and I'm going to hold down Shift and resize this so it fits within, well, maybe I'm not even going to do that yet. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a rectangle that is going to be roughly the size that I want this pixel image to fit into. So I'm going to use my little tracing Spotify screenshot to approximate this. And I'm going to bring this over here into the design that I'm working with. And then also let me very quickly select both of those things, copy them. I'm just going to put this onto a new layer. So this is going to be my images. I'm going to lock out the buttons, going to paste in place. So now those are there. And then I'm going to just put a little outline on this just so I can see it. I know I can see the path, but if you are working with earlier versions of Illustrator, you might not even see that. And the reason why it was invisible was because it had no fill and then no outline applied to it. So I have this screen. And you might be asking, why the heck did I just do that? And you need to use these shapes to create your clipping mask. And what a clipping mask is, essentially, is that you can create a shape, and we're going to start with a rectangle, but you can use more complex shapes to do this. And that shape, you can then say, okay, I'm going to make it so that I only see the elements or the pixels of this pixel image that fall within this shape. So let's just see an example of that, because explaining it, once again, just doesn't quite do it justice. So first, I have this shape on top. The shape that you're using to create that mask, that clipping mask, that always needs to be on top of the image that you are trying to clip. You can think about this in terms of just scissors, right? So you can imagine it as it's a digital pair of scissors. It's going to cut everything that is, it's going to cut this image along this outline of the shape that's on top, and then you're not going to see all the areas that you cut away. So all the areas that were clipped away, you're not going to see. You're only going to see the areas of the pixel image that were within that clipping mask. So right now, if I were to apply this clipping mask to this image, I would have, it would work, so I wouldn't see these areas here, but I would see, and I would see what was within it, but then I would also have this kind of empty space here, and that might not be that big of a deal, but it will probably start to show up a little bit more, especially if you're working with things like squares or more complex shapes where it becomes obvious that there's something missing from that pixel image. So I'm going to just expand this so that it is the entire image falls within the boundary of that clipping mask. And now I'm going to select this rectangle. I'm going to actually switch the outline to be a fill. So in order to use the clipping mask, the shape, the outline doesn't matter. You just want it to have no stroke applied to it, no outline, and then a solid fill. So I'm going to select that shape, make sure it's on top of that image. I'm going to select the image. I'm going to go up to Object. I'm going to go to Clipping Mask. I'm going to say Make, and that is Command 7. So now you see I have my image, and when I hover the selection tool over that image, you still see the boundaries of that whole image, but I also have this path now that is clipping away everything else and only showing this image. So that's awesome. That makes it a lot easier. I don't have to distort my images. If I want to make this a little bit smaller, I can just hold down, just select the image, and that also selects the clipping mask. And then I can, as long as I'm holding down Shift, it's going to maintain the aspect ratio of that image. I can also double click on this object. So this is now a complex object. It has a clipping mask and then a pixel image kind of embedded in one. So if I double click on this, I then can actually see the object itself, and I can see the mask. So if I select I can see the pixel image itself, and I can see the mask. So if I select that pixel image and then move it around, it will move around within the mask. And so again, I'm doing that by, using the selection tool to hover over where the image boundaries are without the clipping mask applied to it, and then I'm moving it around. And I can also then do things like change the scale and then, you know, apply lots of other transformations. And this is, once again, this is in the isolation mode. In order to get into this mode, I have to double click on the complex clipping mask object. So this is holding not only the mask itself, but it's also holding that pixel image. So now I have this, and this is something that you can do in Photoshop. You know, you can crop the image and then you can have it perfectly cropped. But what happens when you want to have something that isn't square or rectangular? And that is, so you can do that in Photoshop. You can export it as a transparent GIF or a transparent PNG file, and then import that into Illustrator, and then it'll usually have that transparency. But you can also do the same thing with clipping masks, and it can be a little bit easier because you're able to adjust those masks and those clipping paths on the fly. So for instance, I'll just show this with starting with this very simple square. I'm going to zoom in here. I'm going to grab my direct selection tool, and I'm just going to hover over this corner. And now if I alter this, so I'm altering this vertex, and this is just again to show how you can use the properties of the objects in Illustrator to edit and distort these masks in ways that you can't really do easily just using Photoshop and the crop tool. So being able to fine-tune stuff like this, if I were doing this in Photoshop, every time I wanted to change one of these edges, I would be having to go into Photoshop again, change the transparencies, change the areas that were transparent, re-export it, bring it back into Illustrator, and here I'm able to just do this by editing the points of that clipping mask. So let me undo that several times. You can also do things like do the rounded corners, and so that gives you that rounded corners feature. And then let me just, yeah, so these are all the things that you can do, just even starting with this very basic clipping mask. Another thing that you can do is you can clip with different objects and more complex objects. So first I'm going to show people how to release a clipping mask. So let's say, all right, I decide I actually want this to be a circle. I don't want this to be a square anymore. So the easiest way to edit a clipping mask, if you decide you want a totally different shape, is you select the whole thing, you go up to Object, you go to Clipping Mask, and you say Release. And then you are left with, these are now ungrouped. You lose that clipping mask, so it doesn't actually delete any of those areas of the image, it just hides them. And then you can go in, and I just deleted that path, and now I'm going to create a circle. And I'm just going to apply a white fill to the circle just so I can see it a little bit more easily. And so now I have this circle, and now I'm going to select the circle, I'm going to select the image below it, I'm going to go up to Object, I'm going to go to Clipping Mask, I'm going to say Make. Now I have this circle, and I can then treat this the same way I would any other object and move it around the same way I would any other object. And if I wanted to edit this, I would double click, and then I can either edit the mask itself, so I'm going to make that smaller, or I can move around the image within the clipping path, and then I'm able to move this around a little bit more within the image. So you can do this with circles, you can do this with polygons, you can do this with complex shapes that you draw with a pen tool, and I'll just show that very quickly as an example. Because something that a lot of times people have definitely asked me about, you know, if they're trying to isolate just an image from a photograph and they only want that, sometimes this can be a way to do that. So I'm just drawing a little outline with a pen tool around my dog. This was in his artsy phase. He was taking lots of self-portraits of himself, of him looking into his reflection. Hopefully people know that was a joke. Okay, so now I have this complex path and this shape that I just created with the pen tool. I'm going to apply a fill to that just to make sure that it's going to produce the clipping area that I am wanting it to. I'm going to select that. I'm going to select the object. I'm going to hit Command 7. And now I have that complex clipping mask applied to that object. So in this situation, unless you're trying to go for a very rough collage look, I wouldn't necessarily recommend it for the UX UI designs. And I think the squares or polygons or triangles, those are all things that are going to work a little bit better for this. But I do want to show people that all those different things are possible when you're working with bitmap images. And this can be a huge time saver when you're trying to fit these bitmap images into certain space. It also can be very useful, for instance, if you are working with a background, and this is, I'm going to have to switch this over. Let's see, let's bring this down below, above the background. So I know that there's a lot of apps that sometimes will apply a photograph for the background wallpaper, and so this is one way to do that and not have to distort that image. So I have this, and then I'm going to create a rectangle that goes around the entire screen dimension that I have outlined on my artboard. I'm going to select that, and then that photo, Command 7, and now that is essentially clipping to the area that I have designated the clipping mask to fit. And then once you have this, you can go through and continue to edit it as though it's its own object. So you can do things like work with the opacity. So I'm changing this opacity a little bit. Maybe I'll set this to multiply. So now you can start to see it. So this is how a lot of UX UI designs integrate images. They're not just like a totally opaque image just on top of the interface. A lot of times they'll do these little opacity changes. They'll change the blending mode. And you can see how this is starting to look like something that you would potentially see as an actual background of an app. And maybe not with my dog, but definitely you know that there are apps that work with images in the backgrounds, and also websites that work with images as part of the user interface in the background, similar to this, where it's this degree of subtlety that isn't distracting, but then adds that layer of meaning to the overall design.